The city of Hydro brought a lot of firsts to Genshin Impact. It was the first time the player was allowed to swim down, the first time řej didn't produce the soundtrack, and the first time I heard the sentence, "Genshin's new storyline is pretty good." It was also the first time that a music track named after a region never actually played in-game, but instead manifested as a concert overture played separately by the London Symphony Orchestra. This overture, titled Fontaine, follows the řejᵒᵒᵐᵃ tradition of blending old sounds with new ones to introduce this land in its own unique way. And if taking a look under the hood of this grand, ominous piece of music sounds like a good time to you, you should totally like and subscribe because I only use clickbait on this one very special day of the year. Fontaine was written by longtime řejᵒᵒᵐᵃ member Paimon, who is now the sole music producer for Genshin Impact. He's doing a fantastic job in the role and deserves recognition for his work, so if you thought řejᵒ was still working at řejᵒᵒᵐ, stop thinking that, I guess. But I don't think this changing of the guard is responsible for the different approach with Fontaine's main theme. It more likely has to do with the Europe-ness and opera-ness of Fontaine's culture. And what would a romantic period opera be without an overture to introduce some of its musical themes? To lean further into this idea, Yuan wrote Fontaine using the conventions of sonata form, which is completely different from writing it as a sonata because everything is terrible. Sonata form has many traits, but the most important one is that to be called sonata form, a piece of music has to be divisible into 3 sections, known as the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation, which is fun to say. These 3 sections closely resemble the 3-act structure of modern films. In the exposition, 1 or 2 concepts are introduced that will serve as the subject matter for the piece. The development is the largest section, where these concepts are expanded upon and often flung through multiple key changes to explore the possibilities of the premise. And then at the moment of climax, the piece shifts into the recapitulation, where the original concepts are revisited, now seen in a new light. Strangely, although there are 3 separate themes in this overture that can be heard elsewhere in the soundtrack, only one of them plays in-game before the 5th and final act of Fontaine's Archon quest. This track premiered in the Fontaine live symphony performance on YouTube 3 months before the story's conclusion was released, so I doubt anyone still remembered the themes from this part of the concert by the time they encountered them in-game unless they rewatched the performance at some point. But I do like the idea of wowing a listener with a musical theme and then letting it hibernate until a later climactic moment. One of these 3 themes I mentioned is introduced in Fontaine's exposition, and the other 2 make up the first and second halves of the development. When I talk about theme, I'm referring to an extended melody that shows up in multiple parts of the soundtrack. Unfortunately, theme is also the word typically used to describe the subject matter of sonata form, so in an attempt to avoid confusion, I'm going to keep referring to said subject matter as concepts. Also, unless otherwise stated, when I say Fontaine, I mean the piece of music, not the region. Okay, with that out of the way, let's meet the 2 concepts in Fontaine's exposition. One is ascending and descending a scale, and the other is a single note called the flat 5th. The first of these 2 shows up right away in the music. Fontaine starts in the key of E minor, which means it mostly uses notes from the E minor scale, and the first theme begins just by writing the first 3 notes up and down. Come to think of it, that's almost the same thing as of Notre Dame. Huh. Well, that sets us up with a very clear mood, just by the choice of instruments and the use of a minor scale. The voices of the musical glasses and the celesta beneath them are dreamy and otherworldly, and minor scales have darker tonalities than their major counterparts. So that's a lot of information already. Because most music can be modeled by a scale containing its most common notes, ascending and descending a scale, even just the first 3 notes, suggests to the listener that that scale may be a good frame of reference for the music in general. For example, by playing the start of the E minor scale, this theme suggests that E is probably the tonic pitch. I know, take a shot every time Jonathan says tonic. Just as most music can be modeled by one scale or another, most music has a tonic pitch, and most listeners know and expect this, whether they're aware of it or not. This tonal center is a comparison point for all other notes and harmonies. We also like hearing the tonic pitch periodically throughout the piece and expect the music to end on it too. And this first theme tells us the tonic pitch is E by playing it on the very first downbeat and then quickly returning to it and pausing there. Ascending and descending in a scale inherently carries a lot of information about the tonic pitch. This will be important to keep in mind when we start talking about modulations. A while later, we encounter the other concept explored in Fontaine, the flat fifth. This note gets its name from its position in most of the scales used in Western music. It fits right between the 4th and 5th degrees, and that places it precisely 3 whole tones away from the tonic pitch, a tritone, if you will. As you can imagine, the flat fifth is a bit uncomfy. Here it is in action. This note is relatively uncommon in Western classical music and its ilk, but here it's played loudly and abruptly and is followed by a brief pause to emphasize how off it sounds. Now we know not to expect a smooth ride from Fontaine's story. You know, if the whole all of it didn't tip you off. So we've met both the concepts to be studied in Fontaine, but the exposition is only half done. As the first theme continues, many other instruments enter. Just then, it sounded like the music doubled in tempo, but it didn't. Individual notes are coming faster in the low ranges, but the overall tempo is exactly the same. It's like an optical illusion, but not optical. It's an illusion, I could have just said that. Now we transition into the development, and the tempo actually doubles. We've entered a rapid waltz section and one of my favorite parts of the track. The music flares on the second count of each measure, which conveys the constant whirling movement of a waltz. Combine the tension in those chords with the frenetic beat, and this transitional phrase is like a demented carousel whisking us from the first section into the second. Here we meet the second theme that will appear elsewhere in the soundtrack, born directly out of the concept of ascending and descending. Actually, that melody kind of reminds me of...
Rolling in Paris, the city awakes to the bells of Notre Dame.
Huh. Anyway, both the first theme and this new one have parts where they just go up and down the start of the E minor scale. Part of why they sound so different from one another is that now the third note lands on the downbeat instead of the first. That changes more than you might expect. The next couple phrases make up the rest of the second theme, and things get tricky here. It's time to talk about modulation. Modulation refers to any time the tonic pitch changes. Although modulation can be found in music from all time periods, it was a staple of sonata form, especially in the development section. And here it comes, baby. In this part, ascending and descending through scales with careful timing allows for modulations so smooth they're hard to notice even when you know they're there. It's easier to play it than to explain it. Just remember that major is happier than minor, and if a note sounds like the definite end of a melody, it's probably the tonic pitch. This is the soul of sonata form, playing around with a concept to see how many different types of sound you can create with it. In terms of how this relates to the region of Fontaine, I think it does a good job of mixing the refined splendor of the city and opera with the mounting turmoil within. You may also have noticed that the instrumentation goes through 2 noticeable changes during the second theme. Here, and here. This is always true whenever this theme plays in the soundtrack. Dimeng Yen commented in the Traveler's Wanderings video that he wanted to use a montage of instruments to enhance drama and suspense. There are many points in this track and others where instrumentation undergoes big changes in quick succession. The second theme repeats itself and, like the first theme, something is darker the second time through. That bright and happy bit we heard near the end with all the modulations is cut short, and instead of modulating to a fourth tonic, we revert to the one that started the sequence. Since this is the second time we've heard a pattern break in an arguably negative way, I'm tempted to think it represents interruptions to everyday life in Fontaine, which I suppose is an understatement. Now our favorite demented carousel returns to spiral us into the second half of the development to meet our third and final theme. The second theme was a development of ascending and descending, so the third one must be about the flat fifth. I wonder what that will be like. Oh, so it's just the entire thing, cool. This is the most dramatic of the three themes, and it quickly starts building toward the climax of the piece. Even more than before, we have modulations and instrumentation changes left and right, but there are no major sounds here, it's all minor. And yet the melody mostly ascends, building anticipation. But especially in this piece, what goes up must come down. Descending softly from up high the way the violins do here sounds mournful to me. I said something similar way back in the Snow and Summer video. I know this has more to do with me than the composer's intentions, but I feel that the staccato strings we hear first represent the prophecy of the Great Flood, and the emotional swell that follows them is the sound of it inevitably coming to pass. Goosebumps, man. Even though I made that up. You know what? Let's all share. Tell me in the comments what images or symbols you think of when you listen to Fontaine. As the tension boils over, the music transitions into the final stretch, the recapitulation. By definition, it doesn't need much dedicated explanation, but I do want to point out something fun. Back in January 2022, there was an interview where Dimeng Yen listed his classical influences, and I hear Chopin and Rachmaninoff pretty clearly in different parts of Fontaine's recapitulation. Most notably, this sounds a lot like Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. You know, Prelude inspired another relatively recent piece of music as well. Okay, so this isn't a coincidence, right? It's not a problem, and it doesn't make Fontaine any less impressive, but I'm just saying, maybe Yuen borrowed a little bit from the other guy who wrote a waltzy overture for a story set in Old France. No judgment. Shoulders of Giants and all that. I just think it's funny. We're about to wrap up here, but first let me say a heartfelt thank you to my Patreon supporters who literally buy me more time to make these videos, and special shout out to the community that maintains the Genshin Impact wiki because your work really sped up the research process for this video. Fontaine's storyline was a big step forward for Genshin Impact, but despite all the talent in Hoyo Mix, I couldn't help but worry that Yupeng Chen's departure would be a bit of a step back. But Dimeng Yen used a centuries-old format to successfully and beautifully introduce us to a shining new world, and those worries were quickly and completely washed away. Now all that's left is to bring it home. Have fun recapitulating. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. I do want to apologize at the end here for saying that I live with Paimon's voice actor just to get clicks.
Wait, are you talking about me?
No.